the Sixth Doctor.
Oh, poor Colin Baker. And this is where I may get a bit controversial, so I apologize in advance. This is an era where, on TV anyways, I really don't get along with the show. And I've met Colin 5 or 6 times over the years at conventions. He's a lovely guy. I love his work with Big Finish. On TV, his Doctor never quite comes together and never quite gels for me. And the stories of his era are all over the place in terms of quality. Part of that is because they went into it with kind of a plan that they would start off with this kind of, in a way, it's a kind of an oddly deconstructionist take on the characters. There's a big thing in mid-'80s pop culture, if you look at it, with, Frank Miller with the Batman comics, with Timothy Dalton's James Bond, but also with Colin Baker's and later Sylvester McCoy's Doctors, the idea of taking these characters apart and taking them back to their roots. And in the case of the Doctor, they wanted to make him kind of more, I don't want to say unlikable, but certainly harder edged, having sort of a more confrontational edge to him. And I think what had happened is that the plan was they were going to soften him up as it went along. He would start off as kind of hard-edged and difficult to get along with, but he would soften up and become more likable and normal. I don't want to say normal by the end of it, but it doesn't help that he starts off with a story called The Twin Dilemma, which is hands down one of the worst pieces of Doctor Who ever made in any medium. It's just, the script's not very good. The show, because it was the end of the season, they tacked on Colin Baker's first story onto the end of Peter Davison's third and final season in the part, so the budget had run out. And I mean this in the nicest possible way, but it very much looks like it. There's also a series of behind-the-scenes issues going on as well. The BBC is in a bit of a financial crunch at that point. There's a new era of executives coming in, particularly Michael Grade, who was the controller of BBC One, which was the channel that Doctor Who went out on, but also a guy named Jonathan Powell, who was basically the executive producer of Doctor Who by virtue of being the head of BBC Drama. And the thing to keep in mind is that Jonathan Powell made his reputation on producing serious drama. His crowning achievements are the trilogy of John le Carré adaptations made in the late 70s, early 80s. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Smiley's People, A Perfect Spy, which are great and wonderful, and I thoroughly enjoy them as a spy geek. But they are about as far away from Doctor Who as you can get. And in early 1985, while Colin Baker's first season is in production, they pulled the plug on it. And Doctor Who basically comes to a stop for 18 months between seasons. And the show kind of, I think at that point, loses momentum, and it never quite gains it back. It doesn't help that when the show does come back, it's not a huge success. It's doing okay, but it's not doing great. And Grade and Powell basically went, you know what? The problem isn't that we've just pulled our show off the air for 18 months, or that really we need a new production team to come in and give the actor scripts. Let's get rid of the actor. And in late 1986, Colin Baker unfortunately got fired from the part. It's very keen, I think, in retrospect. I think Colin got a lot of blame for it simply because he was the lead actor on the show. So it's kind of like, oh, he's the reason the audience never connected. And there's some truth to that we can look back through the documentation that's available through the BBC archives, that if you look at the polling data that was being done, Colin's Doctor wasn't connecting with the general public in the same way that Davison's or Baker's or Pertwee's did. But I think a lot of that has to do with the way he was being written. I mean, it's kind of hard to connect with a character who's one of the first things he does in his first story is try to strangle his companion, for example. That is about as far away from the kind of the vision I think that most of us have of the Doctor. It's certainly pretty far away from my vision of who the Doctor is as a character. But also, going back to what you were talking about with the celery, John Nathan Turner, who was the producer, came up with the brilliant idea that the Sixth Doctor's costume should be utterly tasteless. So basically, they put him in a coat of many colors. It's a patchwork of random stuff. And Colin himself has told this story where the costume designer who was asked to do it was trying to make everything kind of complement each other because, that's what you do as a designer. Even though it's tasteless, you want everything to work. And the producer kept coming back and saying, nope, it's not tasteless enough. And finally, in desperation, just kind of scribbled some things down, not really caring about it, but wanting to show how ridiculous it would be, and held up the piece of paper, and John Nathan Turner went, yep, let's do that. It's an era of a lot of behind-the-scenes drama, not just at the executive level, but also in the production office. John Nathan Turner and Eric Sayward, who was the show's head writer at that point, had a major falling out during Colin's second and final season, the Trial of a Time Lord season, to the point that Sayward wrote a version of the finale for the season and then withdrew it, and they couldn't use it. So they literally had to write the final episode of the Trial of a Time Lord in 3 days, fitting locations and a cast that had already been made based on a version of the script that they couldn't use. So it's an era of high drama behind the scenes that unfortunately isn't well reflected on screen. I mean, it's an era, there's not really a story from that era on screen that I quite like, that I frequently, when I'm sitting around going, I'm going to revisit a classic Who story. To my shame, I suppose, Colin Baker's Doctor is not the one who comes to mind, 9 times out of 10, or 7 times out of 8, I think, to be more accurate. I don't want to sound like I probably sound like I'm being very down on the era, and I do apologize for that.
No, you're being realistic, because when we look at the Big Finish audio dramas, they actually had to take some graces to move the character around to make him likable. And I think that the Big Finish audio dramas actually did that.
Yeah. The Big Finish audios prove beyond any shadow of a doubt in my own mind that what happened with Colin and his Doctor is entirely down to the way he was being written. There's also, Eric Sayward, as I said, had a big falling out with John Nathan Turner. He did an interview in Starburst magazine in 1986, where it was basically a slightly tabloidy tell-all, and it came out that Eric Sayward did not like Colin Baker. Not necessarily as a person, but he thought he was miscast in the role, which having heard him on Big Finish, I completely disagree with. I don't think any of the Doctors have been miscast. On the other hand, I have often wondered if you feel like somebody's not right for a position, are you going to necessarily put 100% of your effort into things? And I think it's telling that the one story from Colin's era that Eric Sayward had a flat out wrote, not that he was doing work on anybody else's script, but the one that he wrote is Revelation of the Daleks. It's probably the best of the Colin Baker TV stories. And wouldn't you know that basically for the first half of that story, Colin Baker's Doctor does absolutely nothing in terms of affecting the plot. He's walking around talking with his companion for 45 minutes plus, not really adding anything to the story. I think it's very telling in a way. But I've said before as well that the behind-the-scenes drama would make a really good book or movie or play. Somebody really needs to go and do kind of a fictionalized take on that, because it's an incredibly dramatic story of the show that's really at the height of its powers in '83. But within 18 months, 2 years, it's been effectively canceled, then put on hiatus, and then the lead actor's fired within a year of that. It's an era of big dramatic changes, and unfortunately most of them not good for the show itself.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the force be with you. Nanu Nanu.